Elena's hand was still shaking when she set the teapot down on the table, and Camille noticed it at once.
"You spilled it again,"
Camille said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning silence.
"Honestly, Elena, must you always be so clumsy? Mother will hear about this."
Elena said nothing. She wiped the small brown stain from the white tablecloth with the edge of her sleeve, keeping her eyes down. It was easier that way. It was always easier to stay quiet than to answer back, because answering back only made things worse. She had learned that lesson many times since her father married Margaret 3 years ago, and she had learned it well. Margaret Sinclair sat at the head of the table, sipping her tea as if nothing at all had happened. She barely looked up. "Elena, dear, do try to be more careful. This is a fine tablecloth, and fine things are not meant for careless hands." "Yes, Margaret," Elena said quietly. Her father, Charles Brooks, was not at the table that morning. He had left early for the harbor, where his shipping business kept him busy from sunrise until well past dark. Elena sometimes wondered if he even noticed how things had changed in his own house since he brought a new wife and a new stepdaughter into it. He was a kind man, but a distracted one, and his kindness rarely reached far enough to see what happened at his own breakfast table. Camille smiled at Elena's discomfort, the way a cat might smile at a mouse it had already caught. She was 18, a year older than Elena, with golden curls that she spent an hour each morning arranging just so, and a wardrobe that filled 2 rooms of the house. She had grown up with everything handed to her, and she expected the whole world to keep handing her things for the rest of her life. "Have you heard the news?" Camille said, changing the subject as quickly as she had started it, the way she always did when she grew bored of tormenting someone. "The Duke of Ashford is hosting a garden gathering next week. Everyone who is anyone has been invited." Margaret's eyes lit up like candles catching flame. "The Duke himself? Oh, Camille, this could be your chance. A duke, unmarried, and said to be looking for a wife at last. You must wear the blue silk. It brings out your eyes." "I was already planning to," Camille said, tossing her curls back with practiced ease. Elena kept quiet, though something inside her stirred at the mention of the gathering. Not because she cared about dukes or gardens or fine dresses, but because for one single day, perhaps, the house might be filled with other people, other voices, and she would not have to sit alone in the corner of every room pretending she did not exist. "Elena will stay home." "Of course," Margaret said, as if reading her thoughts and crushing them in the same breath. "There is far too much to prepare, and someone must manage the household while we are away. Besides, it would hardly be proper for her to attend without a suitable dress, and we simply do not have the funds to spare this season." Elena had heard this excuse before. There was always a reason she could not have new things, could not attend gatherings, could not simply exist alongside the rest of the family as an equal. She had stopped arguing about it long ago. Arguing never changed anything in this house. It only invited more punishment disguised as correction. "I understand," Elena said simply, though a small ache settled in her chest. She excused herself from the table not long after, carrying the teapot back to the kitchen, where the cook, a warm and round woman named Nora, was already kneading dough for the day's bread. Nora had worked for the Brooks family since before Elena was born, and she was perhaps the only person left in the house who looked at Elena with real affection rather than mild contempt. "You are pale again, dear," Nora said, not looking up from her work. "Did they scold you at breakfast?" "It was nothing," Elena said, setting the teapot in the basin. "The usual." Nora shook her head, her hands still moving through the dough. "One day, someone in this house is going to see you for what you truly are. Elena Brooks, kind, clever, patient, beyond what any young woman should have to bear. And when that day comes, I hope I am there to see the look on Camille's face." Elena managed a small smile at that, the first real one of the morning. "You always know what to say, Nora." "Someone has to," Nora replied. "Now go on. Take some air in the garden before Margaret finds another chore for you. You look as though you could use it." Elena did not need to be told twice. She slipped out through the back door and into the small garden behind the house, where a row of rose bushes grew wild along the stone wall. Her mother had planted those roses many years ago, before she passed away, when Elena was only 10 years old. It was one of the few things in the house that still felt like it belonged to her alone, a quiet corner untouched by Margaret's opinions or Camille's cruelty. She sat on the old wooden bench beneath the largest rose bush and let herself breathe for the first time that day. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the town was waking up, carts rattling over cobblestones, a dog barking at nothing in particular, life carrying on as it always did, indifferent to the small sorrows of one overlooked young woman. Elena thought about the gathering at the Duke's estate, and despite herself, she wondered what it might be like. She had heard stories about Julian Ashford, the young Duke who had inherited his title only 2 years before after his father's sudden passing. Some called him serious and reserved. Others called him kind, though guarded, a man who did not easily let people close to him. She had never met him, of course. Why would she have? Men like the Duke of Ashford did not concern themselves with stepdaughters who were kept at home to manage linens and count silverware. Still, there was something in her that longed for more than this house, more than this life of quiet obedience and constant smallness. She did not dream of dukes or titles. She dreamed simply of being seen, of mattering to someone, of walking through a room without feeling as though she must apologize for taking up space in it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the garden path. She turned to see Camille approaching, her golden curls catching the morning light, her expression unreadable in a way that always made Elena uneasy. "There you are," Camille said, sitting down on the bench beside her without being invited, close enough that Elena had to shift slightly to make room. "Mother sent me to find you. She wants the silver polished before noon, since we will need it ready for when the invitations for the gathering are confirmed." "Of course," Elena said, rising to her feet. But Camille caught her wrist before she could walk away, her grip firmer than the moment required. "Elena, I want you to understand something. This gathering, this chance with the Duke, it matters more to me than you could possibly know. Mother has arranged everything so carefully. I will not have anything, or anyone, standing in the way of it." Elena blinked, confused by the sudden intensity in Camille's voice. "I have no interest in standing in your way, Camille. I am not even attending." "Good," Camille said, releasing her wrist. "Keep it that way." There was something in the way she said it, something colder and sharper than her usual careless cruelty, that lodged itself in Elena's chest like a splinter she could not quite remove. She watched Camille walk back toward the house, her steps light and confident, as though the whole world already belonged to her and always would. Elena stood alone in the garden a moment longer, the wind rustling through the rose bushes, and told herself it was nothing. Camille was simply anxious about the gathering, about the Duke, about her mother's expectations weighing on her shoulders as they always did. It was not so different from any other day. And yet, as Elena walked back toward the house to begin polishing silver she would likely never use to serve a meal she would likely never attend, she could not quite shake the feeling that something had shifted that morning. Some small crack had opened between her and her stepsister, one that had always been there, but had never before shown itself so plainly. She did not know, standing in that garden with the scent of roses still clinging to her sleeves, that the gathering at the Duke's estate would change the course of her entire life. She did not know that a chance meeting, born from nothing more than an accident of timing, would set into motion events far greater and far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. All she knew, in that quiet autumn morning, was that she was tired of being invisible, and somewhere deep inside her, a small and stubborn hope refused to be silenced. The rest of the day passed in its usual rhythm. Elena polished the silver until her fingers ached, folded linens, and helped Nora prepare the midday meal, all while Margaret and Camille discussed dress fittings and hair arrangements in the sitting room, their voices drifting through the house like a song Elena was never invited to sing along with. By evening, her father returned home, weary from the harbor, but warm as always, when he greeted her. "How was your day, my dear?" he asked, kissing the top of her head, the way he had since she was a small child. "It was fine, father," Elena said, and she meant it, mostly. It had been an ordinary day, filled with ordinary smallness, the kind she had grown used to enduring without complaint. She did not tell him about Camille's strange warning in the garden. She did not think it mattered enough to mention. It was only later, much later, that she would look back on that moment and wonder if she should have paid closer attention to the coldness in her stepsister's eyes, to the warning hidden beneath her words. But on that autumn evening, with the smell of her father's pipe smoke filling the sitting room and the fire crackling gently in the hearth, Elena allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel something close to peace. It would not last, but she did not know that yet, and perhaps it was better that she did not. Some storms are easier to weather when you cannot yet see them gathering on the horizon, and Elena's storm was still many days away, though it was already beginning to take shape, quietly, in the mind of the stepsister who smiled at her so sweetly across the breakfast table each morning. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of preparations. Margaret seemed to have taken on the energy of a general preparing for battle, inspecting Camille's dresses one by one, sending Nora out for fresh ribbons and lace, and rearranging the sitting room furniture, as though the Duke himself might wander into their modest home unannounced. Elena moved through the house quietly, doing whatever was asked of her, expecting nothing, and receiving nothing, beyond the occasional sharp word, when a task was not completed quickly enough. On the morning of the gathering, the house buzzed with a nervous energy that Elena had rarely seen before. Camille stood in front of the tall mirror in her room for nearly 2 hours, turning this way and that in her blue silk gown, while Margaret fussed over her hair, pinning and unpinning it until it fell in perfect golden waves down her back. "You look radiant," Margaret said, clasping her hands together. "The Duke will not be able to look away." Camille smiled at her reflection, satisfied. "Let us hope you are right, Mother." Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene unfold. She felt no envy, not really. Only a quiet weariness at being so completely excluded from something happening under her own roof. She turned to leave before anyone noticed her there, but Margaret's voice stopped her. "Elena, since you will be here all day, you might as well make yourself useful." The Whitmore family asked if we could send along a basket of preserves for their cook, as a courtesy before the gathering. "Take it to their estate this morning. It is on the way to the Duke's grounds, so you may walk with us partway before turning off." Elena blinked in surprise. It was not often she was given a reason to leave the house at all. "Of course, Margaret, I will see to it right away." She packed the basket with jars of preserved plums and berries, tied a ribbon around the handle, and set off just after midday, walking the same road the carriage would soon travel. The late autumn sun hung low and golden in the sky, and for the first time in weeks, Elena felt something like freedom as she walked along the tree-lined path that led away from the house. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly did not notice the sound of hooves approaching from behind until they were almost upon her. She stepped quickly to the side of the road, clutching the basket to her chest, but the horse suddenly reared, startled by something in the underbrush, a rabbit perhaps, or a sudden gust of wind through the hedges. The rider fought to steady the animal, and in the chaos, Elena's basket slipped from her arms, jars of preserves shattering across the road in a mess of glass and dark red fruit. "Whoa, easy, easy now," the rider said, his voice calm, despite the commotion, and within a few seconds, he had brought the horse fully under control. He dismounted quickly, glancing first at the frightened animal, and then at Elena, concern evident on his face. "Forgive me, miss. Are you hurt? My horse is not usually so easily spooked." Elena shook her head, though her heart was still pounding from the sudden fright. "No, I am quite well, thank you. It was only the preserves that suffered." The man knelt down and began helping her gather what remained of the unbroken jars, setting them carefully back into the basket. It was only as he stood again, brushing dust from his coat, that Elena truly looked at him for the first time, and something in her chest went very still. He was tall, with dark hair swept back from a strong, thoughtful face, and eyes the color of the sea just before a storm, gray and deep and unreadable. He wore fine clothes, the kind that spoke of wealth without needing to announce it, but there was nothing arrogant in his bearing. He looked at her the way one might look at an equal, which was, in itself, a rare and startling thing. "I am terribly sorry about your basket," he said. "Please, allow me to replace what was lost. It is the least I can do, given that my horse is entirely to blame." "That is very kind, but truly unnecessary," Elena said, gathering herself. "It was only preserves, sir, and jars can be replaced easily enough." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression she could not quite place. "You are remarkably calm, for someone who was nearly run down by a startled horse." Elena allowed herself a small smile. "I have learned that very little is gained by making a fuss over small misfortunes." Something shifted in his expression at that, something like genuine interest, as though her simple answer had surprised him more than he expected to be surprised on an ordinary afternoon ride. "That is a rare philosophy for someone so young. May I ask your name?" "Elena Brooks," she said, then hesitated before adding, "And you, sir?" "Julian Ashford." he replied, and Elena felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet. The Duke. She had been standing on the side of a country road, speaking so plainly, so without ceremony, to the very man her stepmother and stepsister were at this moment traveling toward, with all the hope and ambition they possessed. She felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. "Your Grace," she said quickly, dropping into a hurried curtsy, nearly upsetting the basket again in the process. "Forgive me, I did not realize." "Please, there is no need for such formality out here on a dusty road," he said, and there was warmth in his voice now, a genuine ease that put her strangely at ease in return. "I would rather be spoken to as a man than bowed to as a title, if it is all the same to you." Elena straightened, uncertain how to respond to such an unusual request from someone of his standing. "As you wish, Your Grace. I mean, Julian." He laughed then, a short, surprised sound, as though he had not laughed freely in some time, and had forgotten how pleasant it felt. "You are the first person in a very long while to look so uncomfortable saying my given name. Most people would have leapt at the chance to seem familiar with a duke." "I am not most people," Elena said, and then immediately wondered if she had spoken too boldly. But Julian only smiled, a slow and genuine thing that reached all the way to his gray eyes. "No," he said quietly, "I am beginning to see that you are not." They stood there a moment longer, the fallen jars forgotten between them, the horse grazing quietly at the roadside grass as though it too sensed there was no need to hurry this particular moment along. Elena found herself studying him in return, noting the slight furrow of concentration in his brow, the careful, measured way he spoke, as though every word had been considered before it was allowed to leave his mouth. He did not seem like a man accustomed to idle conversation, and yet here he was, lingering on a dusty road with a stepdaughter he had nearly run down. "Are you traveling to my estate today?" he asked finally. "I am hosting a small gathering this afternoon." Elena's chest tightened slightly. "My stepmother and stepsister are attending." "Yes, I am only delivering preserves to the Whitmore household nearby." "I was not invited to the gathering." She had not meant to say it so plainly, and she saw something flicker across Julian's face, something that might have been surprise, or perhaps something closer to sympathy. "That seems a peculiar oversight," he said carefully, "given how thoughtfully you speak." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks again, though this time it was not embarrassment alone. "It is not an oversight, Your Grace. It is simply how things are arranged in my household." He studied her for a long moment, as though turning her words over in his mind, weighing them against something he already suspected but had never had confirmed. "I see," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "Well, perhaps another time then, Miss Brooks." "Perhaps," Elena said, though she did not truly believe it. He helped her lift the remains of her basket, and offered a final apology for the fright his horse had caused, then mounted once more, pausing before he rode on. "It was a genuine pleasure meeting you, Elena Brooks. I hope our paths cross again, under circumstances less dusty than these." "As do I, Your Grace," she said, and meant it more than she expected to. She watched him ride off toward his estate, the same estate where Camille and Margaret were even now preparing to charm him with practiced smiles and rehearsed conversation, and something strange settled in her chest, a small warm ember of feeling she had not experienced in a very long time. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a duke, and she was a stepdaughter sent on an errand with a basket of broken jars. Their worlds did not overlap, no matter how pleasant a single conversation on a country road might have felt. And yet, as she continued on toward the Whitmore estate, her heart still beat a little faster than the walk alone could explain, and she found herself replaying his words, his easy laughter, the way his gray eyes had studied her as though she were someone worth truly seeing. By the time she returned home that evening, the house was already alive with excitement. Margaret and Camille had returned from the gathering, and Camille was practically glowing as she recounted every detail to anyone who would listen. "He spoke with me for nearly 20 minutes, Camille announced to the sitting room at large, though only Margaret and the housemaid were present to hear it. 20 minutes, Mother. No one else received nearly so much of his attention. Did he ask to call on you?" Margaret pressed eagerly. "Not yet," Camille admitted, "but I could see it in his eyes. He was quite taken with me, I am certain of it." Elena listened from the hallway, unseen, and felt a strange, quiet ache settle in her chest. She thought of gray eyes and easy laughter, of a man who had asked to be spoken to plainly, rather than bowed to, and wondered, with a guilt she could not quite explain, whether Camille's 20 minutes of conversation had felt anything at all like the few unhurried minutes Elena herself had spent on a dusty road that afternoon. She said nothing of her own encounter to anyone in the house. It felt, somehow, like something private, something too fragile to survive being spoken aloud in a room where Camille's ambitions filled every corner. She kept it instead like a small secret pressed close to her heart, not yet understanding how deeply that secret would come to matter, nor how much danger it would eventually invite into her quiet, overlooked life. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed while the rest of the house slept soundly around her, Elena found herself smiling into the darkness, thinking of a startled horse, a scattered basket of preserves, and a duke who had looked at her as though she were the most interesting person he had met in a very long while. Word of the duke's gathering spread through the town quickly, as such things always did, and within a few days, it seemed that everyone had an opinion on which young lady had caught his attention. Camille reveled in the speculation, repeating and embellishing the story of her 20 minutes of conversation until it grew into something closer to a private understanding between herself and the Duke, though nothing of the sort had actually been spoken. Margaret, meanwhile, had begun planning as though a proposal were already imminent. She spoke of wedding colors over breakfast, debated whether Camille should be presented in blue or ivory should the Duke request a formal courtship, and sent Nora out twice in a single week to purchase ribbons that matched no particular purpose, beyond Margaret's restless excitement. Elena kept her thoughts to herself during all of this, though it grew harder with each passing day. She had not told anyone of her meeting with Julian on the road, and the longer she stayed silent, the more the secret seemed to grow inside her chest, both precious and uncomfortable in equal measure. She told herself it did not matter. He was a duke. She was nothing to him beyond a brief and pleasant exchange on a dusty afternoon, quickly forgotten once he returned to his grand estate and his grand responsibilities. And yet, 10 days after the gathering, a letter arrived at the house that changed everything. It came by messenger in the late morning, addressed not to Margaret and not to Camille, but to Elena Brooks directly. Nora brought it to her in the kitchen, her eyebrows raised with unspoken curiosity, and Elena's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. The letter was brief, written in a firm, elegant hand. Miss Brooks, I find that our conversation on the road has stayed with me longer than I expected, and I confess I would very much like to continue it under gentler circumstances. My estate hosts a small library open to the public on Thursday afternoons, where local families are welcome to browse the collection. I will be present that day myself. Should you wish to visit, I would be glad of the company. With sincere regard, Julian Ashford. Elena read the letter 3 times before she fully believed the words upon it. Her heart pounded with a mixture of joy and fear, so tangled together that she could not separate one feeling from the other. A duke, writing to her, inviting her, however casually disguised as an open library day, to see him again. It seemed impossible. It seemed, if she allowed herself to admit it, wonderful. But it also seemed dangerous. If Camille or Margaret discovered this letter, discovered that the Duke had taken any interest in Elena at all, the peace of the household, fragile as it already was, would shatter entirely. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the lining of her small wooden keepsake box, the one that had belonged to her mother, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, where no curious eyes would ever think to look. Thursday arrived 3 days later, gray and cool, with a light mist clinging to the hedgerows along the road. Elena told Margaret she wished to visit the town library to select new reading material, a request so ordinary and so rarely made that Margaret barely looked up from her needlework, before granting permission with a distracted wave of her hand. "Take Nora with you if you must go wandering," Margaret said, "though I suppose you are old enough now to manage a simple errand alone." Elena did not correct her about which library she intended to visit. She walked the same road she had walked 10 days before, her heart beating with a nervous anticipation she had never before experienced. And when she arrived at the gates of Ashford Estate, a groundskeeper directed her toward a grand stone building set apart from the main house, its tall windows filled with soft gray light. Inside, the library was quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and polished wood, rows upon rows of books rising toward a high, vaulted ceiling. A handful of local families browsed the shelves, speaking in hushed voices, and for a moment, Elena wondered if she had imagined the entire invitation, if Julian would even be present at all. Then she saw him, standing near a window at the far end of the room, a book open in his hands, though his eyes were fixed not on the pages but on the door, as though he had been waiting for her arrival the entire time. When their eyes met, something in his expression softened, and he closed the book gently and crossed the room to greet her. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice low in deference to the hushed atmosphere of the library. "I confess I was not entirely certain you would come." "I very nearly did not," Elena admitted, matching his quiet tone. "I was not sure it was wise." "And yet here you are," Julian said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Here I am," she agreed. They walked together through the rows of shelves, speaking in low voices about books and authors, about her mother's rose bushes, and his own memories of childhood summers spent in the gardens of this very estate. Elena found herself talking more freely than she had in years, her usual careful reserve slipping away in the presence of someone who seemed genuinely interested in every word she offered. "You mentioned your mother has passed," Julian said gently, as they paused near a shelf of old poetry collections. "I am sorry for that loss." "It was many years ago now," Elena said, "but thank you. My father remarried not long after, and though I do not doubt he loves me, his new family has rather taken up most of the space in our household. The stepmother and stepsister who attended my gathering," Julian said, his tone carefully neutral. Elena nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I did not mean to speak poorly of them." "You did not," Julian assured her. "You spoke only the truth, and there is no shame in that." He hesitated a moment before continuing. "Your stepsister, Camille, was quite determined to make an impression on me that afternoon. She is a striking young woman, certainly, but I confess our conversation left me with little sense of who she truly was beyond her ambitions." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, though a small and guilty warmth spread through her chest at his words. They spent nearly 2 hours together that afternoon, wandering the quiet rows of the library, speaking of books and gardens and small memories, until the light outside began to shift toward evening, and Elena reluctantly admitted she needed to return home before her absence was questioned. "May I write to you again?" Julian asked as they reached the library entrance, his voice quiet but earnest. "I would like that very much," Elena said, and she meant it with a completeness that startled her. Over the following weeks, letters passed between them regularly, carried by a trusted messenger who delivered them discreetly to Nora in the kitchen, who in turn passed them along to Elena without a single word of question, though her knowing smile said more than enough. Elena and Julian met twice more at the library, and once in the town market under the guise of coincidental timing, though both of them understood it was nothing of the sort. Elena had never felt so completely herself with another person. Julian did not seem to care that she wore simple dresses instead of silk, that she had no dowry to speak of, that she spent her days managing linens and polishing silver rather than attending grand social gatherings. He asked about her thoughts, her opinions, the books she loved and the small dreams she rarely allowed herself to voice, and he listened to her answers as though they mattered a great deal. But secrets, however carefully guarded, have a way of surfacing when least expected, and Camille was not a woman easily fooled for long. It began with small things. A servant from the Ashford estate recognized Elena in the town market and greeted her warmly by name, well within Camille's hearing. A letter arrived one afternoon while Nora was occupied elsewhere, and Camille intercepted it before Elena could retrieve it from the front hall table, only for Elena to snatch it back with more urgency than an ordinary letter would have warranted. Camille said nothing of her suspicions at first. She watched, quiet and calculating, gathering small pieces of evidence the way a spider gathers threads for its web, patient and unhurried, certain that the full picture would eventually reveal itself. It was nearly a month after Elena's first meeting with Julian that Camille finally confronted her, catching her alone in the garden one gray afternoon while Margaret was occupied elsewhere in the house. "You have been meeting with him," Camille said, her voice low and cold, stripped entirely of the sweetness she usually performed for their mother's benefit. "The Duke. You have been meeting with him behind my back." Elena's heart lurched, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Camille, it is not what you think." "Is it not?" Camille's eyes were hard, glittering with something Elena had never seen in her stepsister before, something far colder than jealousy alone, A servant recognized you by name at the Ashford Estates library. Letters arrive for you that you hide the moment anyone approaches. Do you take me for a fool, Elena? I never meant to hurt you, Elena said quietly, and she meant it. Despite everything, despite years of small cruelties and constant dismissal, she had never wished ill upon her stepsister. It happened by chance. His horse startled on the road, and we spoke, and it simply continued from there. I never sought to take anything from you. You did not need to seek it, Camille said, her voice rising slightly, before she caught herself and lowered it again, glancing toward the house to ensure they remained unheard. You took it simply by existing, by being quiet and modest and endlessly patient, in a way that men apparently find charming. I have spent my entire life being told I must shine brightest, must secure the finest match, must justify my mother's every sacrifice, and you have taken the one chance that mattered most without even trying. That is not fair, Elena said softly. I did not ask for any of this. Fair has nothing to do with it, Camille said. I will not lose this, Elena. Do you understand me? I will not lose the Duke to my father's forgotten stepdaughter, no matter what it takes to prevent it. There was a finality in her voice, a coldness that settled over the garden like an early frost, and Elena felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She wanted to reassure her stepsister, to explain that whatever existed between herself and Julian was not a competition, not a prize to be won or lost, but something far more genuine and far less calculated than anything Camille had ever attempted with him. But Camille was already walking away, her golden curls catching the pale afternoon light, her shoulders set with the same rigid determination she brought to every ambition she had ever pursued. Elena remained alone in the garden, the rose bushes rustling softly around her, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly and deeply afraid, though she could not yet have said of what exactly. She did not know, standing there among the fading autumn roses, just how far her stepsister was willing to go to secure the future she believed she alone deserved. She would not learn the true depth of that determination until it was very nearly too late. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a chill that settled deep into the stones of the old house and into the already strained relationships within it. Camille's confrontation in the garden had not led to open warfare, not yet. But the atmosphere between the stepsisters had shifted into something watchful and tense, a truce neither of them fully trusted. Margaret, ever oblivious to the currents running beneath her own roof, continued planning, as though Camille's engagement to the Duke were merely a matter of time and proper presentation. She had no notion that her stepdaughter had been quietly exchanging letters and stolen afternoons with the very man she hoped to see married into their family, and Elena had no intention of enlightening her, not while the ground beneath her still felt so uncertain. It was Julian who suggested the retreat, though the idea had originated, as so many things did, with his aunt, Lady Beaumont, a spirited widow who had taken it upon herself to host a small gathering at her coastal estate before the full weight of winter made travel impossible. She had heard enough from her nephew about a certain thoughtful young woman he had met on a dusty road to insist that the Brooks family, all of them, be included among the invited guests. I do not know how she managed it, Julian admitted to Elena during one of their quiet library meetings, but my aunt has decided she wishes to meet you properly, without the pretense of accidental encounters in library afternoons. She has invited your entire household to Beaumont House for 3 days by the sea. Elena's stomach tightened with a mixture of excitement and dread. Camille will be furious if she suspects the invitation was extended because of you. The invitation was extended because my aunt enjoys company, and the sea air does wonders for her spirits, Julian said, though the small smile playing at his lips suggested he understood perfectly well what such an invitation might stir among her family. What anyone chooses to suspect beyond that is not something either of us can control. The invitation arrived at the Brooks household 2 days later, addressed formally to Margaret, and the house erupted into a frenzy of preparation once more. Margaret was beside herself with delight at securing such a prestigious connection, certain it signaled the Duke's serious intentions toward Camille, and even Elena was included in the travel arrangements this time, if only because Lady Beaumont's invitation had specifically named the entire Brooks family without exception. I do not understand why she wants all of us, Camille said, eyeing Elena with open suspicion as the household packed trunks for the journey. It seems a peculiar sort of hospitality to extend to a household's entire staff and family alike. Perhaps she is simply a generous woman, Margaret said, too pleased with the invitation itself to question its finer details. Elena said nothing, though she felt Camille's eyes upon her throughout the packing, sharp and searching, as though her stepsister were assembling one final piece of a puzzle she had already mostly solved. Beaumont House sat perched along a dramatic stretch of coastline, its gray stone walls rising above cliffs that dropped steeply toward the churning waters below. The estate was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way, quite unlike the manicured gardens of Ashford, with paths that wound along the cliff tops offering breathtaking views of the sea, and gardens that gave way to rocky outcrops where gulls wheeled and cried overhead. Lady Beaumont herself was a delightful surprise, a woman well past 60, with sharp eyes and a sharper wit, who welcomed the Brooks family with genuine warmth, though Elena noticed the particular attention the older woman paid to her, studying her with open curiosity throughout their first evening together. "So you are the young woman my nephew cannot seem to stop mentioning," Lady Beaumont said quietly to Elena, as the household gathered for dinner on their first night, her voice low enough that only Elena could hear it. "I confess, I was curious to meet you myself." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am not certain what your nephew may have said, my lady, but I assure you there is little of note in my circumstances." Lady Beaumont's sharp eyes softened with something like amusement. "My dear, Julian has never in his life spoken so often or so warmly of anyone, note or otherwise. I find that far more telling than any circumstance of birth or fortune." Elena did not know how to answer that, so she simply offered a small, grateful smile and allowed the conversation to move elsewhere, though she was aware, throughout the remainder of dinner, of Camille's gaze drifting toward her again and again, cold and calculating beneath a mask of polite conversation. The following morning, Lady Beaumont proposed a walk along the cliff-top path before the midday meal, an activity she insisted was essential to fully appreciating the beauty of her estate. The path wound along the edge of the cliffs, bordered on one side by wild grasses and low stone walls, and on the other by a sheer drop toward the rocks and churning waves far below. Julian joined the walking party, along with his aunt, Margaret, Camille, and Elena, while Charles Brooks remained behind, with a slight cold that had settled upon him during the journey. The group moved slowly along the path, pausing frequently to admire the view, and Julian found himself walking beside Elena more often than not, their conversation quiet but warm, drawing occasional sharp glances from Camille that neither of them fully registered in the moment. As the morning wore on, the group naturally spread out along the winding path. Lady Beaumont walked ahead with Margaret, the two women deep in conversation about matters of household management that held little interest for the younger members of the party. Julian had fallen back to point out a particular rock formation to Elena, something about the way the tide had carved it over centuries, and for a few moments, Camille found herself walking several paces behind them, alone with her thoughts and her mounting frustration. She watched the easy warmth between Elena and Julian, the way he leaned slightly toward her as he spoke, the way Elena's laughter carried on the sea breeze in a manner Camille had never once managed to inspire in him despite all her careful effort and calculated charm. Something cold and sharp twisted in her chest, a feeling she had carried for weeks now but had never allowed herself to fully examine, and in that moment, watching the two of them together against the backdrop of the churning sea, the feeling crystallized into something far more dangerous than jealousy alone. "Elena," Camille called out, her voice carrying a false brightness that did not quite mask the tension beneath it. "Might I have a word with you? Privately, if the Duke will excuse us for a moment." Julian glanced at Elena, with a slight furrow of concern, but Elena offered him a small, reassuring nod. "Of course, I will only be a moment." She walked back to join Camille, allowing the small distance between herself and Julian to grow, as the path curved slightly away from the main group, the wind picking up around them, as they moved closer to a particularly narrow stretch, where the path hugged the very edge of the cliff, the low stone wall crumbling in places from years of exposure to the harsh coastal weather. "What did you wish to speak with me about?" Elena asked, once they were far enough from the others that their conversation would not easily carry. Camille's expression had shifted entirely from the false brightness of moments before, settling into something hard and unreadable. "I warned you, Elena. In the garden, weeks ago, I told you I would not lose this." Camille, please, Elena said, glancing nervously toward the crumbling edge of the path beside them, the sea crashing against the rocks far below with a sound that seemed suddenly very loud, very close. This is not the place for this conversation. There is never a good place, is there? Camille said, her voice low and trembling now, with an emotion Elena could not fully identify, something that seemed to hover between fury and desperation. You have taken everything, Elena. You always take everything, simply by being quiet and patient and letting the world feel sorry for you. And I am tired of it. I am tired of watching you win without even trying, while I fight for every scrap of attention I have ever received. I have taken nothing from you, Elena said, her voice pleading now, aware of how close they stood to the crumbling stone wall, how the wind seemed to pull at her skirts, as though urging her back from the edge. Camille, please, let us walk back toward the others and speak of this calmly. But Camille was no longer listening. Her eyes had taken on a wild, unfocused quality, and her hands, when she reached out, were shaking with an emotion far too large for the narrow cliff-top path to contain. I will not lose this, Camille said again, her voice cracking now, and in the next instant, before Elena fully understood what was happening, Camille's hands were upon her shoulders, shoving her hard toward the crumbling edge of the path. Elena's foot caught against a loose stone, and the world tilted sharply beneath her. She felt the ground give way at the very edge of the cliff, felt her balance vanish entirely as gravity took hold, and for one suspended, terrifying moment, she was falling, the gray sky and churning sea spinning together into a single blur of panic and disbelief, her scream torn away by the wind before it fully left her throat. Julian heard the scream before he fully understood what it meant. He had been walking only a short distance ahead with his aunt and Margaret, pointing out a distant lighthouse along the horizon, when the sound cut through the wind, sharp and terrified, and something in his chest turned to ice before his mind had even finished processing what he heard. He turned instantly, breaking into a run along the narrow path, his heart pounding with a fear more intense than anything he had felt in years. He rounded the curve of the cliff path just in time to see Elena's hand still visible above the edge, her fingers white and desperate against a jagged outcrop of rock, her body dangling over the churning sea far below, held only by the thinnest margin of her own grip and whatever remained of the crumbling earth beneath her. "Elena!" Julian shouted, closing the remaining distance in what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. He dropped to his knees at the very edge of the path, ignoring every instinct that screamed at him to stay back from the crumbling ground, and reached down with both hands to grasp her wrist, just as her fingers began to slip from the rock. "I have you," he said, his voice fierce with determination, though his own heart hammered against his ribs with a terror he had never before experienced. "I have you, Elena. Do not let go." "I am trying," Elena gasped, her voice raw with panic, her other hand scrabbling against the rock face for any purchase at all, small stones and loose earth crumbling away beneath her fingers and falling into the void below. Julian tightened his grip on her wrist, feeling the strain immediately in his shoulders and back as he began to pull, the crumbling edge of the path shifting dangerously beneath his own knees. He could hear Camille somewhere behind him, her voice high and frantic, calling out words that made no sense to him in the moment. Something about an accident, about Elena slipping, about how she had only meant to speak with her. "Do not look down," Julian said firmly, keeping his eyes locked with Elena's, refusing to let even a flicker of his own terror show through, though his arms burned with the effort of holding her weight against the pull of gravity and the churning wind. "Look at me, only at me. I will not let you fall." Elena's eyes, wide with terror, found his, and held there, and something in the fierce steadiness of his gaze seemed to anchor her against the panic threatening to overwhelm her entirely. She nodded, unable to speak, and focused every remaining ounce of her strength on maintaining her grip while Julian pulled. It took only seconds, though it felt to both of them like something closer to an hour, before Julian managed to haul her up and over the crumbling edge of the path, both of them collapsing backward onto solid ground well clear of the drop, Elena's entire body trembling violently as the reality of how close she had come to death began to settle into her bones. Julian did not let go of her immediately. He pulled her fully into his arms instead, both of them still on the ground, both of them shaking, and held her there, as though letting go even for a moment might somehow undo the rescue he had only just managed to complete. You are safe, he murmured against her hair, his own voice unsteady now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of what had nearly happened crashed over him instead. You are safe, Elena. I have you. I fell, Elena managed to say, though even as the words left her mouth, something in her memory snagged against them, refusing to settle into place quite so simply. I do not understand. I was walking, and then the ground gave way, and she trailed off, her mind still too clouded with shock and fear to fully process the sequence of events. But a small, cold certainty had already begun to take root, somewhere beneath the panic. She had not simply lost her footing on crumbling ground. She remembered hands, firm and deliberate, pressing against her shoulders in the instant before she fell. By now, the rest of the party had reached them, Lady Beaumont's face pale with shock, Margaret hovering nearby, with hands pressed to her mouth, and Camille, standing slightly apart from the others, her golden curls disheveled by the wind, her expression a carefully composed mixture of horror and relief that did not quite reach the coldness still lingering in her eyes. Thank heavens, Margaret said, rushing forward to fuss over Elena, though her concern felt strangely performative, even in the midst of genuine crisis. Elena, dear, are you badly hurt? What on earth happened? She lost her footing, Camille said quickly, before Elena could gather her own scattered thoughts enough to answer. The path is terribly crumbled in that section, Mother. I tried to grab her, but it happened too quickly. I have never been so frightened in my life. Elena looked up at her stepsister, still trembling from both the cold and the shock, and found Camille's eyes locked upon her own, with an intensity that carried an unmistakable warning beneath its surface fear. Say nothing, that look seemed to insist. Whatever you think you remember, say nothing. Julian, still holding Elena carefully, glanced between the two stepsisters, and something in his expression suggested he had caught the exchange, though he said nothing of it in the moment, focused instead on the immediate task of ensuring Elena received proper care. We must get her back to the house at once, he said firmly, rising and helping Elena to her feet with careful, steadying hands. She needs warmth and rest, and I intend to send for a physician to be certain no lasting harm has come to her. The walk back to Beaumont House passed in a blur for Elena, her body moving mechanically while her mind replayed those final moments before the fall, again and again, searching for certainty amid the chaos of memory and shock. Had Camille truly pushed her, or had panic and confusion simply distorted an accident into something more sinister than it actually was? She wanted, desperately, to believe the latter. She did not wish to believe that her own stepsister, however cruel and cold she had been over the years, was capable of something so deliberately dangerous. And yet the memory of those hands upon her shoulders, firm and purposeful, refused to soften into vagueness no matter how many times she examined it. Once back at the house, Elena was settled into a warm bed, with heated stones wrapped in cloth placed at her feet, and a physician was summoned from the nearest town, arriving within the hour, to examine her for any injury, beyond the deep bruising already forming along her arms, and the raw scrapes upon her palms from her desperate grip against the rock face. You are remarkably fortunate, the physician said, completing his examination. A fall of that height, onto rocks such as those, could easily have proven fatal. She will be sore for some days, and the bruising will take time to fade, but there is no lasting damage that I can find. Rest and warmth are all she requires now. Margaret hovered anxiously throughout the examination, while Camille remained conspicuously absent, claiming a headache that kept her confined to her own room for the remainder of the afternoon. Julian, however, refused to leave Elena's bedside, seated in a chair pulled close to the bed, his expression grave and watchful even after the physician departed, with reassurances of her recovery. You do not believe it was simply an accident, Elena said quietly, once they were finally alone, the fading afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. I saw the way your stepsister looked at you, both before I reached you and after. I do not know precisely what happened on that path, Elena, but I do not believe for a moment that it was simply crumbling ground and unfortunate timing. Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion and fear washing over her in equal measure. I remember hands upon my shoulders, Julian. I remember being pushed, but I do not wish to believe it. She is my stepsister. Whatever cruelty has passed between us over the years, I never imagined she could be capable of something so. She could not finish the sentence, the word too heavy, and too frightening to speak aloud. But Julian reached forward and took her hand gently in his own, his thumb tracing careful circles against her bruised skin. "You do not need to decide anything tonight," he said softly. "Rest now, and let your body recover from what it has endured. But I promise you this, Elena. I will not allow whatever happened on that cliff path to simply be forgotten or explained away. If your stepsister did what I believe she did, there will be consequences for it, however long it takes to uncover the full truth." Elena studied his face in the fading light, the fierce protectiveness evident in every line of his expression, and felt something shift within her own chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heated stones warming her feet beneath the blankets. Whatever fear and uncertainty the day had brought, she was no longer facing it entirely alone, and that realization, more than any physician's reassurance, was what finally allowed her exhausted body to surrender to much-needed sleep. Outside her window, the sea continued its endless churning against the base of the cliffs, indifferent to the near tragedy that had unfolded along its edge that afternoon, while somewhere else in the great house, Camille sat alone in her darkened room, staring at her own trembling hands, wrestling with a guilt and fear so overwhelming that she could not yet bring herself to examine what she had truly done, nor what it might ultimately cost her. Elena slept fitfully through the night, waking often to the sound of the sea, and the memory of falling still fresh enough to jolt her upright in the darkness, her heart racing, until she remembered she was safe, warm, and no longer teetering upon the edge of a crumbling cliff. By morning, her body ached with deep bruising, but her mind had cleared enough to think through the events of the previous day, with something closer to steady certainty. She remembered the push now, with complete clarity. There had been no accident of crumbling stone alone. Camille's hands had been firm and deliberate against her shoulders, and the force behind them had carried an intention Elena could no longer explain away as panic or misunderstanding. Still, she said nothing of this certainty when Margaret visited her room that morning, fussing over her bruises and insisting she remain in bed for the full remainder of their stay at Beaumont House. Camille did not visit at all, sending word through a servant that her headache had worsened overnight, and she preferred to remain in her own quiet room. "She is terribly shaken by what happened," Margaret said, smoothing the blankets around Elena with unusual tenderness. "She has not stopped speaking of how frightened she was, watching you nearly fall. You must not blame her for staying away, Elena. Guilt affects people in strange ways." Elena studied her stepmother's face, searching for any sign that Margaret suspected the truth, but found only genuine, if slightly performative, concern. Margaret truly believed the story Camille had told on the clifftop, the tale of an unfortunate accident and a desperate but failed attempt to catch her before she fell. Elena wondered, not for the first time, how much of Margaret's blindness toward her daughter's flaws was willful, and how much was simply the natural result of a mother's love clouding her judgment beyond all reason. "I do not blame her," Elena said carefully, though the words felt heavier in her mouth than she expected. It was not entirely a lie. She did not yet know what to do with the truth she carried, and until she decided, silence seemed the safer path. Julian visited later that morning, once Margaret had left to attend to other matters, and closed the door quietly behind him, before settling into the chair beside her bed once more. His expression was troubled, and Elena could see the weight of a sleepless night reflected in the shadows beneath his eyes. "I spoke with one of the estate's gardeners this morning," he said, his voice low. "He was tending to the hedges along the lower section of the clifftop path yesterday, close enough to the incident that he witnessed a portion of what occurred, though he was too far away to hear any words spoken between you and your stepsister." Elena sat up slightly, her attention sharpening despite the ache in her bruised shoulders. What did he see? "He saw two figures standing close together near the crumbling section of the path," Julian said carefully. "He saw one figure place both hands upon the other's shoulders, and he saw the second figure fall almost immediately after. He did not see it as an accident, Elena. He described it, in his own words, as a clear and deliberate push." A chill ran through Elena that had nothing to do with the lingering cold from her ordeal the previous day. "Will he speak of this openly? To my father, perhaps, or to Margaret?" Julian's jaw tightened. "He is a servant on my aunt's estate, and he understands well enough the delicate position such testimony would place him in, speaking against a guest of standing within this household. He has agreed to tell the truth if formally asked, but he will not offer it unprompted, out of fear for his own position." Elena absorbed this information slowly, her mind working through the implications with a clarity that surprised her, given how thoroughly the previous day's events had shaken her. If we confront Camille directly, she will simply deny it, and Margaret will believe her daughter over any servant's testimony, and quite possibly over my own as well. I have learned that lesson many times in that household. Then we must approach this carefully, Julian said. I do not wish to see your stepsister to escape accountability for what she has done, Elena, but I also understand that a hasty confrontation, without sufficient proof, may only result in you being disbelieved and further isolated within your own family. Elena appreciated the careful consideration in his words, the way he weighed not only justice but her own well-being within whatever path they chose forward. What do you propose then? Julian considered for a long moment before answering. Allow me to speak with my aunt first. Lady Beaumont has a sharp mind and considerable influence, and she witnessed enough of the tension between you and Camille over these past few days to lend credibility to concerns raised, even before any formal accusation is made. With her support, and the gardener's testimony if it becomes necessary, we may be able to bring the full truth to light, in a manner that cannot be so easily dismissed or denied. Elena nodded slowly, grateful for his measured approach, even as a part of her still recoiled from the idea of what such a confrontation might ultimately cost her family, fractured as it already was. And if Camille continues to deny it entirely, even faced with such testimony, then the truth will still stand upon its own merit, Julian said firmly. I will not allow fear of scandal or family discomfort to bury what nearly happened to you yesterday, Elena. You very nearly lost your life. That is not a matter I am willing to simply set aside for the sake of preserving false peace within your household. Over the following 2 days, as the Brooks family's stay at Beaumont House drew toward its planned conclusion, a quiet undercurrent of investigation continued beneath the surface of polite conversation and careful courtesy. Lady Beaumont, once informed by her nephew of the gardener's account, took it upon herself to speak privately with several members of her household staff, gathering what additional details she could without alerting Camille or Margaret to the growing scrutiny surrounding the incident. A young housemaid, it turned out, had also witnessed a portion of the confrontation from a distance, having been sent to gather fresh linens from a nearby cottage and finding herself close enough to the cliff-top path to observe the tense exchange between the stepsisters, though, like the gardener, she had been too far away to hear the words exchanged. Her account matched the gardener's closely enough that any reasonable observer would have found the coincidence of 2 entirely separate accidental interpretations difficult to sustain. Elena, meanwhile, found herself caught between dread and a strange, steady resolve as the pieces of evidence quietly accumulated. She did not relish the thought of exposing her stepsister's cruelty so openly, nor did she look forward to the inevitable rupture such exposure would cause within her already fragile family. But she also could not simply pretend the incident had never happened, could not simply allow Camille to continue believing that such dangerous behavior carried no consequence at all. On their final evening at Beaumont House, Lady Beaumont arranged a quiet gathering in her private sitting room, ostensibly to bid the Brooks family a fond farewell before their departure the following morning. Margaret and Charles, who had recovered from his cold enough to join the final days of their stay, attended along with Camille and Elena, while Julian remained present as well, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena could sense the tension coiled beneath his composed exterior. Before you all depart tomorrow, Lady Beaumont began, once tea had been served and the initial pleasantries exchanged, I find I must address a matter that has weighed upon me since the unfortunate incident on the cliff-top path. Camille's expression flickered, just slightly, though she recovered her composure quickly enough that only Elena, watching closely, caught the momentary crack in her carefully maintained calm. Of course, Margaret said, glancing between her hostess and her daughter with mild confusion. Is there some concern regarding Elena's recovery? I assure you, she is doing remarkably well, given the severity of the fall. It is not her recovery that concerns me, Lady Beaumont said, her sharp eyes settling upon Camille, with an intensity that made even Charles Brooks straighten slightly in his chair, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. It is the nature of the fall itself that concerns me, Margaret. I have received accounts from 2 separate witnesses on my staff, neither of whom had any opportunity to conspire with the other, describing what occurred on that path in terms rather different from an accidental slip upon crumbling ground. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. Margaret's face had gone pale, her eyes darting toward her daughter with the first flicker of genuine uncertainty Elena had ever witnessed from her stepmother. "Camille," Charles Brooks said slowly, his voice carrying a weight Elena had rarely heard from her usually gentle and distracted father. "What precisely occurred on that cliff-top path?" Camille's composure finally began to crack in earnest, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, her golden curls seeming somehow dimmer in the firelight than they had appeared just days before. "It was an accident," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confident edge. "I only meant to speak with her. I never intended for her to fall." "But you did place your hands upon her," Julian said quietly, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "You did push her toward that crumbling edge, whatever your intentions may have been in the moment before." Camille's eyes filled with sudden tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simply the panic of finally being caught, Elena could not entirely determine. "I was so afraid of losing everything," Camille said, her voice breaking. "Everything Mother has worked toward, everything I believed I deserved, after years of striving for a match worthy of this family's hopes. I saw the way you looked at her, Your Grace, the way she seemed to earn your attention so easily, while I fought for every scrap of yours, and something in me simply broke in that moment. I did not think it through, I only reacted." The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the confession settling over each person present in different and complicated ways. Margaret had covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears already streaming down her face, while Charles Brooks stared at his stepdaughter with an expression of profound disappointment and disbelief. Elena, for her part, felt no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction at seeing Camille's careful facade finally crumble under the weight of truth. She felt instead a strange, hollow sadness, a grief for the relationship she and her stepsister had never truly been permitted to build, poisoned as it had been from the beginning, by comparison and competition neither of them had fully chosen for themselves. "You very nearly killed her, Camille," Charles said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you understand the gravity of what you have done? Your own stepsister, pushed toward her death over jealousy and ambition." "I know," Camille whispered, burying her face in her hands. "I know what I have done. I do not expect any of you to forgive me for it." Lady Beaumont, watching the scene unfold with careful, measured attention, finally spoke again, into the heavy silence that followed. "What happens next, I believe, is a matter for your own family to determine. But I will say this, whatever consequences follow, I trust they will reflect the true seriousness of what has occurred here. A young woman very nearly lost her life upon my property, and I will not simply allow the matter to be quietly buried for the sake of preserving appearances." Margaret, through her tears, turned to look at Elena with an expression Elena had never before seen upon her stepmother's face, something that looked almost like genuine remorse. "Elena, I am so sorry. I never wished to believe that either of you could." She could not finish the sentence, overwhelmed by the full weight of what her blind favoritism had nearly cost. Elena, despite everything, found herself reaching out to place a gentle hand upon her stepmother's trembling arm, a small gesture of comfort she had not expected to offer but somehow could not withhold. "We will find our way through this," Elena said quietly, though even as she spoke the words, she understood that nothing within her family would ever return to what it had been before that afternoon, on the cliff-top path, and perhaps, given everything that had happened, that was not entirely a loss worth mourning. The journey home from Beaumont House passed in near total silence, the carriage rattling along the coastal road, while each member of the Brooks family sat wrapped in their own private thoughts, the events of the previous evening still hanging heavily over all of them. Camille stared out the carriage window for most of the journey, her face pale and drawn, while Margaret clutched a handkerchief in her lap, dabbing occasionally at eyes that seemed permanently rimmed with red since the confession. Charles Brooks broke the silence only once, somewhere past the midpoint of their journey, turning to address his wife with a weariness Elena had rarely seen from her usually cheerful father. "Margaret, we must discuss what is to be done. This cannot simply be forgiven and forgotten, as though it were a minor disagreement between sisters." "I know," Margaret said quietly, not looking up from her lap. "I have been trying to think of what could possibly be adequate, Charles, and I confess I do not know. She is my daughter, but Elena is your daughter, and what Camille did to her, She could not finish the thought, and the carriage lapsed back into silence for the remainder of the journey. Once home, the household settled into an uneasy new arrangement. Camille remained largely confined to her room over the following days, emerging only for meals, which passed in strained and mostly silent affairs. Margaret, chastened by the events at Beaumont House, had begun treating Elena with a cautious, unfamiliar kindness that Elena did not entirely trust, though she found herself grateful for the reprieve from years of casual dismissal nonetheless. It was nearly a week after their return when Charles finally called a family meeting in his study, summoning Elena, Margaret, and Camille together to discuss what consequences would follow from that terrible afternoon on the cliff-top path. Elena entered the study with some apprehension, uncertain what her father intended, though she trusted his judgment enough to believe he would not act rashly or unfairly toward either of his daughters, by blood or by marriage. "I have given this matter a great deal of thought," Charles began, once all three women were seated before his desk. "What happened at Beaumont House was not a minor lapse in judgment, Camille. You very nearly caused the death of your own stepsister, and I cannot, in good conscience, simply allow that to pass without serious and lasting consequence." Camille kept her eyes fixed on her lap, her hands twisting together nervously. "I understand, Father. I do not ask for leniency." "Good," Charles said, "because I have decided you will spend the coming year away from this household, staying with your aunt in the northern countryside, where you will have ample time and quiet distance to reflect upon what you have done, and to reconsider the values that led you to such a desperate and dangerous act. Your engagement prospects, whatever they may have been, are no longer my primary concern, nor should they be yours." Margaret opened her mouth as though to protest, then closed it again, perhaps recognizing that any argument in her daughter's defense would only weaken whatever small trust remained between herself and her husband in the aftermath of this crisis. "As for the wider consequences," Charles continued, his voice grave, "Lady Beaumont has indicated that her staff's testimony will be recorded formally, should the matter ever need to be revisited. I do not intend to pursue this further through public or legal channels, largely out of consideration for Elena's own wishes in the matter, and because I believe some measure of private accountability may serve better than public scandal in bringing about genuine change. But should anything of this nature ever occur again, Camille, I promise you the consequences will not be so measured." Camille nodded silently, tears streaming freely down her face now, though she made no further argument in her own defense. Elena, watching this exchange, felt a complicated tangle of emotions she could not easily separate from one another. There was relief, certainly, at seeing some measure of accountability finally applied to years of casual cruelty and, ultimately, genuine danger. But there was also a lingering sadness, a grief for the sister she had never truly had, and a discomfort at being the reason for such a significant rupture within her family, however justified that rupture might be. "Camille," Elena said quietly, once her father had finished speaking, drawing surprised glances from both her stepmother and her stepsister. "I do not say this to diminish what happened, or to suggest it should be forgiven easily. But I hope that wherever you go, whatever this next year holds for you, you find some way to make peace with whatever led you to that moment. I do not wish you ill, despite everything." Camille looked up at her, genuine surprise evident in her tear-streaked expression, as though she had expected anything from Elena except grace in this moment. "I do not deserve your kindness," she said quietly. "Perhaps not," Elena said, without malice. "But I find I do not wish to carry bitterness forward from this, Camille. It would only poison whatever remains of the years we still have ahead of us as a family, however strained that family may now be." Camille departed for her aunt's estate in the northern countryside 3 days later, the household falling into a quieter, more subdued rhythm in her absence. Margaret, true to her promise, made genuine efforts over the following weeks to treat Elena with the fairness and consideration she had long withheld, though the change came slowly and awkwardly, neither woman quite certain how to navigate this unfamiliar new dynamic between them. Word of the incident, despite Charles's efforts to keep the matter private, inevitably reached certain corners of local society, carried by servants' gossip and the natural curiosity that surrounds any prominent family's sudden and unexplained rearrangement. Elena found herself the subject of considerable sympathy and speculation in equal measure, though she largely avoided public gatherings during this period, preferring the quiet comfort of her mother's rose bushes and the gradual healing of both her body and her spirit. Julian visited often during these weeks, his concern for her well-being evident in every careful, patient gesture. He never pressed her to discuss the incident before she was ready, never rushed her recovery or her processing of everything that had occurred, content instead simply to sit with her in the garden, to walk with her along quieter paths than the one that had so nearly claimed her life, to remind her, through steady and consistent presence, that she was valued and safe. "You have been remarkably patient with me these past weeks," Elena told him one afternoon, as they sat together beneath the rose bushes that had once belonged to her mother, the last of the season's blooms clinging stubbornly to their thorny branches, despite the deepening chill of approaching winter. "I would wait considerably longer than a few weeks for you, Elena," Julian said simply, his gray eyes steady and sincere, in a way that made her chest ache with a warmth she was only beginning to fully trust. "What happened to you was not something to simply recover from overnight. I only wished to ensure you never felt alone, in whatever time that recovery required." Elena studied his face, the quiet steadiness of his expression, the genuine warmth that had never once wavered since that first accidental meeting on a dusty country road so many weeks before.
"I do not know how to properly thank you," she said softly, "for reaching that edge in time."
"For believing me, when so few others in my life ever have. You owe me no thanks," Julian said, taking her hand gently in his own, his thumb tracing careful patterns against her palm, still faintly marked with the healing scrapes from her desperate grip against the cliff face. "I only did what any person of conscience would do, faced with someone in danger. But I confess, Elena, that reaching that edge and finding you there, so close to being lost forever, made something entirely clear to me, that I had perhaps been avoiding admitting even to myself." "And what was that?" Elena asked, her heart beginning to quicken. "That I could not bear the thought of a world without you in it," Julian said quietly. "That whatever uncertain path brought us together, whether by a startled horse or a quiet library afternoon, I have come to care for you more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone, and I do not wish to spend another day pretending otherwise." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the sorrow that had marked so much of the preceding weeks. "I have come to feel the very same, Julian, though I confess, given everything that has happened, I hardly know what to do with such feelings, or where they might lead us from here." Julian smiled then, the same warm, unguarded smile she had first glimpsed on that dusty road months before, and reached into his coat pocket to withdraw something small and carefully wrapped in soft cloth. "Perhaps," he said, "we might discover that together, if you are willing." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she watched Julian unwrap the small object he had produced from his coat pocket, the soft cloth falling away to reveal a delicate ring, its band fashioned from pale gold and set with a single, modest sapphire that seemed to catch and hold the fading autumn light in its depths. "It was my mother's," Julian said quietly, turning the ring gently between his fingers. "She wore it every day of her life, and my father always said it was the one possession she treasured above all others, not for its value, but for what it represented to her, a promise of steady, unwavering devotion, given freely and without condition." "Julian," Elena said softly, her voice catching in her throat, "I know this has been an extraordinary and difficult season for you," Julian continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "and I do not ask this lightly, nor do I expect an answer given in haste. But I find that I do not wish to wait any longer to make my intentions plain, Elena. I love you, not for your circumstances, nor despite them, but simply for who you are, quiet strength and gentle patience and all. I would be honored beyond measure if you would agree to become my wife." Elena felt the weight of months of careful hope and quiet longing rise within her chest all at once, mingling with the lingering shadows of fear and uncertainty that had marked the recent weeks since her fall. But beneath all of it, steady and clear, was a certainty she had rarely allowed herself to feel about anything in her life until now. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." He slipped the ring gently onto her finger, his hands steady despite the emotion evident in his expression, and then drew her carefully into his arms, mindful still of the healing bruises along her shoulders, holding her as though she were something precious and rare, which, in his eyes, she had always been. News of the engagement spread through the household and the wider town with remarkable speed, carrying with it a wave of astonishment and delight in equal measure. Nora wept openly upon hearing the announcement, embracing Elena with a fierceness that spoke of years of quiet worry, finally giving way to genuine joy. "I always knew someone would see you properly," Nora said, wiping tears from her weathered cheeks. "I only hoped I would live to witness it." Margaret's reaction was more complicated, a tangled mixture of genuine happiness for Elena and a quiet, private grief for the very different future her own daughter had forfeited through her own desperate actions. But whatever complexity lingered beneath the surface, Margaret offered Elena warm and sincere congratulations, along with a promise to help however she could in preparing for the wedding celebrations to come. Charles Brooks, for his part, could hardly contain his pride and joy at the news, embracing his daughter with a warmth that reminded Elena powerfully of the years before Margaret and Camille had entered their household, when it had been simply the two of them against the world, father and daughter, finding their way forward after the loss that had shaped so much of Elena's quiet, careful nature. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion as he held his daughter close. "She always said you carried more strength within you than anyone around you seemed to notice. I am only sorry it took circumstances so frightening for the rest of the world to finally see it too." The wedding was planned for the following spring, allowing sufficient time for proper preparations and, more importantly, for Elena's full physical and emotional recovery from the events of the previous autumn. Julian insisted on a modest ceremony, understanding well enough that Elena had never craved grand spectacle or public attention, and Elena found herself deeply grateful for a partner who understood so instinctively what would bring her genuine comfort rather than simply what tradition or status might otherwise demand. Word eventually reached Camille, in her aunt's quiet northern household, of Elena's engagement to the Duke. She wrote a brief letter in response, her handwriting notably less confident than the flourishing script Elena remembered from years past, offering stiff but seemingly genuine congratulations, along with an acknowledgement that she understood now, with the clarity that distance and quiet reflection had afforded her, just how deeply her own jealousy and desperation had nearly cost everyone involved far more than a broken engagement or a wounded pride. "I do not expect forgiveness," Camille wrote, "and I do not ask for it. But I wanted you to know that the time I have spent here, away from the pressures and comparisons that shaped so much of my behavior, has given me a clearer understanding of the person I wish to become, rather than the person I allowed myself to be shaped into. I hope, in time, we might find some way toward a peace between us, however modest it may be." Elena read the letter several times, feeling the weight of complicated emotions settle over her, before finally penning a brief response of her own, offering neither full forgiveness nor continued resentment, but simply an open door toward whatever gentler relationship might eventually be possible between them, given enough time and genuine change. Winter passed slowly into spring, and as the rose bushes in the garden began showing their first tentative green buds, preparations for the wedding accelerated in earnest. Julian's estate underwent careful preparation for the ceremony, and Lady Beaumont, delighted beyond measure at the match her invitation had inadvertently helped bring about, insisted on personally overseeing many of the finer details, determined that the celebration reflect both the genuine warmth of the union and Elena's own understated preferences. On the morning of her wedding, Elena stood before the same tall mirror where she had once watched Camille prepare for the Duke's original gathering, though the reflection staring back at her now bore little resemblance to the quiet, overlooked young woman who had once stood in doorways unnoticed, wondering if she would ever matter enough to anyone beyond the walls of her own modest garden. Her gown was simple but elegant, pale ivory silk that caught the morning light streaming through her bedroom window, and her hair had been arranged not in elaborate curls but in a soft, natural style that Nora had insisted suited her far better than any fashionable pretension. Around her neck hung a small locket containing a portrait of her mother, a quiet reminder that though so much had changed in her life, the foundation of who she truly was remained rooted in the love and strength her mother had first instilled in her many years before. "You look radiant," Nora said, tears gathering once again in her kind eyes, as she helped fasten the final details of Elena's gown. "Your mother would be so very proud, watching you today." "I hope she is watching," Elena said softly, smoothing the silk of her gown with careful hands. "I hope she can see how far I have come, and how much happiness has finally found its way to me." The ceremony itself was held in the small stone chapel on Ashford's estate grounds, filled with close family and a modest gathering of friends, the late spring sunlight streaming through tall windows to cast warm golden light across the assembled guests. Charles Brooks walked his daughter down the short aisle, with tears openly streaming down his weathered face, and Margaret, seated in the front pew, dabbed at her own eyes throughout the entire ceremony, her earlier complicated grief having largely given way, in the months since the engagement, to genuine and uncomplicated joy for her stepdaughter's happiness. Julian stood waiting at the altar, his gray eyes fixed on Elena from the moment she appeared in the chapel doorway, his expression carrying such open and unguarded warmth that Elena felt any lingering nervousness dissolve entirely beneath the steady certainty of his gaze. When she finally reached him, taking his offered hand, he leaned close enough to whisper words meant only for her. "I have loved you since a startled horse and a basket of broken preserves brought you into my path," he murmured, "and I will love you for every day that remains to us, however many years that may be." "And I you," Elena whispered back, her heart full to bursting, with a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. The ceremony proceeded with the simple, heartfelt vows both had carefully chosen to reflect their genuine feelings, rather than mere tradition. And when Julian finally kissed his new wife before the assembled gathering, a warm cheer rose from the guests, echoing through the small stone chapel and out across the estate grounds where the sea, faintly audible in the distance, seemed to carry the sound further still, out across the very cliffs, where Elena had so nearly lost everything less than a year before. In the months and years that followed, Elena settled into her new life as Duchess of Ashford, with a quiet grace that endeared her deeply to the tenants and staff of the estate, who quickly came to recognize in her the same thoughtful patience and genuine kindness that had first captured Julian's attention on that dusty country road. She oversaw the estate's gardens with particular devotion, planting new rose bushes alongside cuttings, carefully transported from her mother's original garden, ensuring that small, precious connection to her past continued to bloom within her new and far brighter future. Camille returned from her year in the northern countryside, a notably changed young woman, quieter and more reflective than the ambitious, desperate girl who had once pushed her stepsister toward a cliff's edge, out of jealousy and fear. She did not attempt to reinsert herself fully into Elena's new life, understanding well enough the boundaries that genuine trust required time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. But she wrote regularly, small updates on her own quiet efforts to build a more genuine and less desperately competitive existence. And slowly, carefully, a fragile but real peace began to grow between the stepsisters, rooted not in forgetting what had happened, but in a shared willingness to move forward with honesty rather than pretense. Margaret, too, found herself transformed by the events of that autumn, her blind favoritism toward her own daughter giving way, over time, to a more balanced and genuine affection for both young women under her care. She often visited Elena at Ashford Estate, delighting in her stepdaughter's happiness with a warmth that felt, at long last, entirely sincere, rather than performed for the sake of appearances. Elena often found herself returning, in quiet moments, to that terrifying instant when the ground had given way beneath her feet, when she had felt certain that her life was about to end upon the rocks far below. It remained a memory that occasionally surfaced in her dreams, sharp and frightening even years later, but she had come to understand it too, as the moment that had ultimately led her toward everything good and true that followed. Had she not fallen, had Julian not reached that edge in time, she might never have discovered the depth of love and belonging that had, in the years since, become the very foundation of her life. On quiet evenings, seated beside her husband in the gardens of Ashford Estate, watching their own children play among the rose bushes that had traveled with her from her mother's garden so many years before, Elena often thought back to that overlooked, invisible young woman who had once sat alone in a different garden, wondering if she would ever truly matter to anyone at all. She was profoundly grateful, in those quiet, reflective moments, that life had ultimately proven that young woman wrong, that patience and quiet strength had, in the end, been enough to carry her toward a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. And though the cliff path at Beaumont House remained forever marked in her memory as the site of both her greatest terror and her greatest deliverance, Elena found, in time, that she could walk it again without fear, hand in hand with the man who had reached the edge in time, both of them grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought them together upon a dusty road so many seasons before, and for the courage and love that had carried them safely through every difficult season since. 5 years after her wedding, Elena stood once more at the edge of the very cliff path where her life had so nearly ended, though now the walk carried none of its former dread. Beside her, a small girl with dark curls, and her father's steady gray eyes, clutched tightly to her hand, pointing excitedly toward a pair of gulls wheeling above the churning waves far below. "Mama, tell me the story again," the child insisted, tugging at Elena's skirts with the persistent energy only a 5-year-old could muster. "The story of how you and Papa met." Elena smiled, kneeling carefully to bring herself to eye level with her daughter, little Rose, named for the garden that had meant so much to her own mother so many years before. "Well, it began with a very startled horse," Elena began, and Rose's eyes lit with delight, having heard this particular telling many times before, but never once growing tired of it. Nearby, Julian watched the scene with quiet contentment. Their younger son, barely 2 years old, balanced comfortably on his hip, as the boy babbled happily at the passing seabirds. Lady Beaumont, now well into her 70s, but still as sharp and spirited as ever, sat upon a bench overlooking the water, delighted to have her family, by blood and by the marriage she had unwittingly helped bring about, gathered once more at her beloved coastal estate. "It hardly seems possible," Lady Beaumont said, as Julian settled onto the bench beside her, "that it has been 5 years since that terrible afternoon. Watching you both now, so plainly happy, it is difficult to remember how close we all came to a very different outcome entirely." "I think of it often," Julian admitted, watching Elena and Rose walk slowly along the safer, inland portion of the path, well clear of any crumbling edges, not with the fear it once carried, but with a strange sort of gratitude. That single terrifying afternoon changed the entire course of my life, and hers, for the better, however painful the path toward that better outcome may have been. Elena had maintained gentle but genuine correspondence with Camille throughout the years since her wedding, and their relationship, while never quite reaching the closeness of true sisterhood, had settled into something honest and cautiously warm. Camille had, in time, found her own quiet happiness, marrying a modest but kind country gentleman who valued her for herself rather than for any grand ambition or social advancement, and their letters, once filled with careful reserve, had gradually grown into something closer to genuine friendship. Margaret, now grown considerably older and gentler with the passing years, spent much of her time dividing visits between her daughter's quiet country household and her stepdaughter's grander estate, delighting equally in the happiness of both young women in ways she had never quite managed during the difficult years of their shared youth. Charles Brooks, too, remained a frequent and beloved visitor at Ashford Estate, delighting endlessly in his grandchildren and often remarking, with tears of joy rather than sorrow, at how completely his daughter's life had transformed since that frightening autumn so many years before. Elena often thought, in quiet moments, about the strange and winding path that had carried her from an overlooked, unwanted stepdaughter to a woman who now walked confidently through a life filled with genuine love, purpose, and belonging. She thought of her mother's rose bushes, still blooming faithfully each spring in the gardens of Ashford Estate, their roots having traveled so very far from where they had first been planted, much like Elena's own journey from that quiet, invisible girl to the woman she had ultimately become. She thought, too, of the courage it had taken, in the aftermath of her fall, to speak the truth rather than allow silence and fear to bury what had truly happened on that cliff path. That courage, she had come to understand, had not simply saved her own life and reputation, but had ultimately allowed for genuine healing and change within her entire family, painful and difficult though that process had been. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, casting long golden shadows across the clifftop path, Elena gathered her children close, and Julian rose from the bench to join them, wrapping his arms around his small family with the same steady warmth that had first drawn Elena to him on a dusty country road so many years before. "Shall we walk back before the evening grows too cool?" Julian asked, taking little Rose's free hand in his own while Elena continued to hold the other. "Yes," Elena said, glancing once more toward the churning sea below, toward the very edge where her life had so nearly ended, and, in the same breath, had truly begun. "Let us go home." They walked together along the familiar path, the sound of the sea fading gradually behind them, as they made their way back toward the warm lights of Beaumont House, where a simple family dinner awaited them, filled with the easy laughter and genuine affection that Elena had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Behind them, the cliffs stood silent and enduring as they always had, holding within their ancient stone the memory of a single terrifying afternoon that had, against every expectation, ultimately given way to a lifetime of quiet, hard-won happiness. And somewhere in the deepening twilight, as gulls called softly overhead and the first stars began to appear above the darkening sea, Elena felt, more powerfully than ever, the simple and profound truth that had carried her through every difficult season of her life, that even the most frightening falls, the most painful betrayals, could sometimes lead, through courage and honesty, and the steady presence of those who truly loved us, toward a happiness far greater than anything we had once dared to imagine for ourselves. The end.